Yawakawa. And so with that, we'll begin our closing. I have a few announcements. But first, what we'd like to thank everyone that came forward to share your expertise and your experiences today. We thank you for your honesty and your courage. And I know I introduced myself, but I didn't speak about the work that I do. And I'm currently an assistant professor at McGill University, but my research focuses on Indian day schools. And so the nature of my work is very similar in gathering the stories that were shared here today. So I have experience gathering heavy stories, and we have medicine and we have ceremony to help us with those. Those stories can be burdensome. And so our care team is reminding me that, we have many people watching on the live stream and we need to send them love. And so before we do the closing statement, and we'd like to do something to help lift the spirits of everyone so we don't leave with too much heaviness in our hearts. And so I'm thinking back to the day we opened the sacred fire and the words of Ganasoho that we're here to speak truth to power. And I really feel that these first 3 days of this tribunal exemplified that. And so I like to call Ganasoho up to just speak a few words of closing. And our care team, some members of our care team will also come up to do a song. And then we have someone coming up to do the recap of the day, which will end the session, and final announcements then. So Ganaso, if you would please give us a few words. Our care team feels that it's very important to offer some words of encouragement. Yawakawa.
Margaret, Zenidu was Wadadi one is rather. Toske Yuri Wakste, Zinio Boya Tawa. Next, Ayawanski Skana as a one of Tunuet, and a Jutku as a Wada agreed again. Next, and Ayokto Nezawa Nigura. So, just a couple of words to acknowledge all of the ones that have spoken, that have had the courage to talk about their experiences and what happened to them. And all I said is that we ask that the powers of the universe, however we conceive that it'll bring some comfort to your mind and to your heart, give you the love and the support, the comfort that you need, so that eventually as we'll get through this and move into the future, that happiness will lift up and those smiles and the happiness of that joy will return, so that we can continue to dance and to love this life that we're here for just a very short period of time. So these are some of the words that I figured I'd say at this time. Thank you. Merci.
So we'd like to call up Janice Makokis to do the recap of the day. And then we'll have our care team sing us out. So that'll be the last things we leave with is that medicine, and that'll close the session. And following that, we'll reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. So Janice, will you please come up? Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Janice Makokis. I'm a Nehiawisquo Cree woman from the Lake Cree Nation located in Treaty 6 territory, what is now called Alberta. I'm also a law professor at the Faculty of Law, University of Windsor, and I'm speaking on behalf of the prosecution team and the Indigenous Legal Advisory Committee regarding today's proceedings before the Permanent People's Tribunal. Today's hearing focused on evidence related to survivor initiatives and investigations around student deaths and Indian residential schools in Canada, specifically archival research, ground search, advocacy for survivors and commemoration, memorialization, protection, and the evolving challenges of residential school denialism. And this afternoon, forced and coerced sterilization, specifically the sacredness of motherhood, framed within Indigenous governance structures of First Nations, the impact of systemic racism, what consent is, and the intergenerational impact and trauma related to genocide that sterilization has on passing on our Indigenous nationhood. I will briefly summarize the evidence presented today and its significance to the proceedings through a variety of themes that I identified in listening to the proceedings. The survivor testimony. Today, the panel heard from survivor testimony from Jackie and Kahsenniyo, who are survivors of forced and coerced sterilization. The panel testimony on forced and coerced sterilization established that Indigenous women experience sterilization within broader systems of colonial violence, racism, medical control, child apprehension, and genocide. Survivors and experts describe sterilization not as isolated misconduct, but as part of interconnected state systems designed to control Indigenous reproduction, family formation, and Indigenous futures. The testimony highlighted the lifelong impacts on survivors, families, nations, and future generations, while also emphasizing Indigenous healing practices, ceremony, and Indigenous-led advocacy. One of the themes was forced sterilization as colonial violence and genocide. The theme throughout this testimony was that forced and coerced sterilization constitutes genocide because it intentionally interferes with Indigenous women's ability to reproduce and continue their nations. One survivor described the moment she recognized the broader meaning of what happened to her, stating, quote, "If I think what has happened to me, that it was an act of genocide." The survivors explained that sterilization impacts not only individuals, but entire nations, clans, and their future generations. A second theme identified was lack of consent and medical coercion. Survivors described being sterilized during childbirth while physically restrained, medicated, frightened, vomiting, or under severe medical distress. One survivor testified stating, quote, "I was numb from the armpits down, strapped to the operating table," end quote. She described being repeatedly pressured while unable to respond. The physician ultimately proceeded without informed consent. The testimony described that coercion occurred in contexts where Indigenous women were vulnerable, were threatened with medical consequences, were racially judged, and were denied meaningful and informed consent. Another theme was racism and dehumanization in healthcare systems. Witnesses repeatedly testified that racism within hospitals and healthcare systems normalized sterilization and the judgment of Indigenous mothers. The testimony described assumptions that Indigenous women were unfit mothers, and healthcare systems treating Indigenous reproduction is a problem to manage. Another theme was intergenerational trauma and lifelong harm. Survivors described forced sterilization as producing profound and lifelong emotional, spiritual, physical, and cultural harm. One survivor stated, quote, "It took me a really, really long time to accept what happened to me," end quote. Another theme, the connections that were being made between residential schools, child welfare, and sterilization. The testimony situated forced sterilization within broader colonial systems that included residential schools, Indian hospitals, child welfare systems, medical experimentation, and forced child removals. Another theme was the disruption of culture, kinship, and nationhood. Survivors emphasized that sterilization disrupts Indigenous cultural continuity and responsibilities to future generations. One survivor stated, quote, "There are children that aren't here that had duties and responsibilities." The testimony described how birth stories, kinship teachings, clan systems, language transmission, and matriarchal roles are disrupted by sterilization. Witnesses framed reproductive autonomy as directly tied to Indigenous self-determination and nationhood. One of the final themes from this panel was healing through Indigenous ceremony and community. Survivors and experts emphasize that healing requires Indigenous cultural practices, ceremony, community support, and survivor-led approaches. Witnesses described healing through ceremony, community, storytelling, reconnecting spirit and body. The testimony strongly criticized Western-only trauma frameworks and stressed the importance of Indigenous-led healing systems. I'm going to move on to the expert testimony. So the panel heard evidence from Laura Arndt, an expert in survivor-led initiatives at the Mohawk Institute Survivor Secretariat, Dr. Scott Hamilton, an expert in fur trade, historic archaeology, and ethnohistory. Specific to this tribunal's work, Indigenous-led and community-based heritage and investigations at Indian residential schools, and Dr. Brenda Reynolds, an expert in trauma counseling and contribution to mental health education. So some of the core themes that came from the expert testimony included: one, survivor-led work is essential and grounded in responsibility to community. Witnesses consistently stress that investigations, memorialization, and ground searches must remain survivor-driven and community-led. That work is not merely technical or academic, it's relational, sacred, and tied to responsibilities owed to children, families, ancestors, and nations. Laura Arndt emphasized that bringing survivors together is essential, and she stated, quote, "If I can't bring survivors together to do the work, how can we do this work?" The witnesses described the work as involving archival and records research, ground searches, commemoration, survivor advocacy, protection of burial sites, community stewardship over information and data. Another theme was chronic underfunding and bureaucratic barriers that obstruct the truth. This was the dominant theme in this conversation was that federal funding processes are restrictive, inconsistent, and structurally harmful. Laura Arndt described the funding process as, quote, "death by 1,000 cuts." The expert witnesses testified that funding was cut unexpectedly. Organization proposals meeting all requirements identified by government funding deadlines were still denied. Organizations faced impossible deadlines and timelines. The essential works was stalled due to lack of government resources. The expert witnesses linked these barriers to Canada's broader historical colonial relationship with Indigenous peoples and argued that withholding resources prevents the full truth from emerging and contributes to this increasing phenomena of residential school denialism. And the next theme is denialism as being organized, escalating, and harmful. A major focus of this testimony concerned the rise of residential school denialism and the ways government actions contribute to this. Laura Arndt stated, quote, "Canada fuels the denialist landscape when they pull the rug out of funding from communities," end quote. And Dr. Hamilton stated, quote, "Unrelenting, highly organized, and choreographed hate," end quote, when discussing residential school denialism. They explained that this happens through social media attacks being coordinated. Communities consistently face harassment and intimidation. Denialism isolates survivors. The funding cuts reinforce this public skepticism that if they're not being able to find bodies, then it can't be true. Denialism threatens memorialization efforts and community safety. The testimony framed denialism not as isolated ignorance, but as part of a broader systemic refusal to confront truth and accountability. Another theme was Canada controls access to information and records. Witnesses repeatedly emphasized that the truth cannot be fully uncovered without complete access to records and data. Laura Arndt stated, quote, "There's over 27 million documents out there that haven't been accessed or shared. Canada doesn't want the truth to come out," end quote. Dr. Hamilton noted, quote, "We don't know what we don't know because we don't have the full picture without all the information or documents before us," end quote. The key issues raised included incomplete records, lack of transparency, fragmented archives, jurisdictional barriers, control over data. The last theme from this panel was trauma related to genocide, intergenerational trauma, and its generational impacts. The testimony established that Canada bears ongoing responsibility for the intergenerational harms caused by colonial policies and genocide, including trauma that continues across generations, and therefore has an obligation to provide long-term healing supports, reparations, and sustained funding for survivors, families, and communities. In addition to the oral testimony of survivors and expert witnesses, the prosecution relied on extensive documentary and exhibit evidence to corroborate patterns of colonial violence, institutional knowledge, systemic discrimination, and the ongoing impacts of residential schools, missing Indigenous children investigations, and forced and coerced sterilization. In closing, today's evidence forms part of the prosecution's ongoing presentation concerning Canada's responsibility over the missing Indigenous children and unmarked graves as a result of the Indian residential school system. The evidence demonstrated that survivor-led initiatives are essential to uncovering the truth about missing Indigenous children and unmarked graves. The testimony also revealed how systemic underfunding, denialism, and restricted access to records continue to obstruct accountability and justice. The witnesses called for sustainable support, survivor governance, and full transparency in order to continue this work and honor the children who never returned home. And the last panel we just heard from talked about the ongoing intergenerational impacts and trauma of these colonial systems that link all of this together. This summary is intended to provide general context regarding the evidence heard today and should not be interpreted as findings or conclusions by the Permanent People's Tribunal. The hearing will resume tomorrow with evidence from legal expert witness Fanny LaFontaine on genocide and crimes against humanity. Kinanaskum Tinawao. Hi, thank you.
Thank you, Janice. And I'll call up our care team to sing us out. And I would just like to make two final announcements. Just a reminder to please clean up your area before you leave. And also that our care team will be available in the 10 afterwards if anyone would like to be smudged or clean before you leave today. Yawakoa tukni waktikedes.
Almost every nation has a round dance verse, and we ask everybody to think about your round dance, think about going to powwows, think about going to potlucks, potlatches, any dances that you weren't able to attend, you're now free to do. So you can join us to sing. will.